Okay, welcome everybody. Again, as usual, you can put any comments in the chat if you have any particular questions. But today we have Elsa. We had Elsa about a month ago. Remember, I met her in Europe, where she is from, and then she came out for a month to, I guess, a little bit less than a month because you met me kind of halfway to tour around in a van the Western United States. And then also on are Ryan and Eddie. Eddie is my little brother. So this will be fun to talk about. We're going to talk about some things that we mentioned a little bit. And the last time we talked to Elsa, we're going to be talking about self. And I thought we could kind of start by talking about a book that Elsa mentioned last time she was on, and it's Bruce Hood, The Illusion of Self. So I've been listening to it on Audible, and I was able to get to, I think I'm on like chapter, maybe like a third of the way. So Elsa was like, I read it so long, I don't remember. And I don't think either Ryan or Eddie have listened to it at all. But first, let's get kind of everybody's baseline thoughts about what self are. Does anyone want to go first, or I can go first? Elsa?
I wanna go first, but with a question. So
Yes.
last time you said, like when we talked, you said you're going to try to drink your own urine. And did you do it? And follow-up question, how did it taste and how was it?
Man, I totally spaced that. You know, I am going to try to do it now because
Okay,
especially
I'm so disappointed now. I'm so disappointed. But
okay. So you want to go first on the self issue too?
no, you can start on that one. I just wanted to know, yeah, how your urine tasted.
Uh-huh.
Apparently you didn't try.
You know, yes, I will try because I'm still
Okay.
really interested. And then Ryan,
Next time I will ask you, so I won't forget that. I will write it down.
okay, sounds good. Ryan and Eddie, do you guys want to go first, or you want me to go first?
You go first.
All right. So my conception of self, and I have to admit, Elsa, this book, I'm really glad that you recommended it because I think kind of one of the things, you know, and I almost feel like a born again Christian about this, like with regard to the self, because before I went to therapy at all, I didn't have like really any conception of the self at all. And this is what we talked about last week, is that it's very difficult for us to talk about ourselves, to describe ourselves. I think just to quickly recap last week, I said, for I think the average psychopath, you don't think of yourselves like, I don't think of myself as being female. I don't think of myself as being late 30s. I don't think of myself as being even an attorney, a lawyer. You know, I don't think of my profession, my ethnicity, my generation, my where I grew up. I don't think of myself as being an American, really. You know, like there's just I know that those things are true about me, but I just don't conceive of myself in those ways or any way at all. It's not like I have achieved some sort of like Zen state in which I have realized that those things are just accidents upon birth. It's more like I just never was kind of socialized to identify with those as part of self. And then through therapy, though, I started learning and kind of acknowledging that there was something going on there, a self, right? And actually, my therapist did it pretty cleverly. First of all, I think I may have mentioned this before, but just to rehash, he was really clever about hiding the ball from me. So I'd go to therapy, and I think that we were just chit-chatting the whole time. And at the end, I was like, did we even talk about any therapy? Did we do any therapy? So that was pretty good. But the second thing he did is he said, here's a thought experiment to imagine that you're the only one in the world. And if I was the only one in the world, what would I choose? And that really helped me to understand how much I was kind of just making decisions based on how other people would react. You know, like if I say, let's go eat pizza, you know, is pizza what everybody wants or is it not what everybody wants? And, you know, like everything was always a kind of focusing on like what the outcome would be of a choice and how people would react. So in focusing just on myself, I was able to understand a little bit better that I have a preference. Like maybe I don't like pizza as much as I thought, sort of thing. And then I had like this sense of self, and I kind of, you know, like taking again this analogy to born again Christian. I feel like I'm like now like proselytizing, like everybody needs a sense of self, and that is true that I am doing that. But I also think, you know, like the Bruce Hood book is interesting because it's like, well, even normal people who have a sense of self, you know, not just psychopaths with no sense of self, their sense of self is not necessarily what they think it is, and it's perhaps not as expansive. So it's been really helpful to read the book. And so we'll kind of talk about some of the ways that I think Bruce Hood has kind of attacked what I thought was maybe like what the sense of self was, and how he, you know, how maybe I agree with him. Who wants to go next, Elsa or Ryan and Eddie? How about Ryan and Eddie? You guys tell us your background.
I'll go because I have some thoughts. So, as first of all, I'm a big believer in the fact that identity crisis, identity struggle is like a collective thing. Everyone, even like, well, I think there are people who are maybe really in touch with their identity, and there's definitely like a connection between like whether you're neurotypical or not and that sort of thing. But I think that just like, especially young people, like people in their 20s or whatever, like trying to figure out who you are is kind of the point of life, and therefore it's a struggle for everyone. But so as someone who's not necessarily neurotypical myself, like that's something I'm still struggling with, is my sense of self. And I think that, you know, maybe that issue in and of itself is what differentiates neurotypical people and non-neurotypical people, with the caveat that yes, I think everyone's like trying to figure out who you are is like the life quest. But for me personally, so I've always struggled with language to using language to identify who I am, and labels. I've always tended towards the most ambiguous labels I can. You know, when people ask me about gender, I like labels like gender fluid, or if people ask me about sexuality, I like queer. I like to choose kind of like the most ambiguous labels, because it never felt right, like being so specific. And that might be a reflection of just like a weak sense of self that I have. And I actually kind of went through this exercise recently in trying to figure out who I am, where for a while, like when I try to think about me and the things that are about me, I would just think about things that I liked, you know, things that I had interest in. And I realized like those aren't me. Like I like those things, but they aren't me. Like I can't describe myself by describing the things that I like. But what I then did was did this exercise where I was like, what does liking this mean about me? Like, why do I like these things? And that kind of helped me like go down a path of being like, okay, there are now maybe a couple things I can say about myself that may be true about my identity right now. So for example, I really like horror movies. I really like stuff that's dark and spooky. And I asked myself, like, why do I like that? Like, what joy do I find in it? And I realized maybe the thing that says about me is just kind of like, I'm not like a really, and at least in that way, like nothing is too sacred for me. Like I like being scared. I like things that push the boundaries. Like I'm not really someone who's afraid of the dark. Like I'll conjure up images in my head just to spook myself for like the fun of it. And like that was the thing that was like about me or about myself or my identity, less than just the things that I liked. But kind of that exercise helped me just in the same way that your thought experiment of imagining being the only person in the world kind of helped you in that regard.
That's interesting. And then Eddie?
Yeah, my sense of self has really changed over time, from growing up in, you know, a Christian family or whatever, where you just assume self equals soul, but that doesn't really help. That's not really any more descriptive than just saying self. To going, you know, falling out with that church, and then in college, in my master's degree, we spent a lot of time reading Lacan and talking about the mirror stage, and that's been really formative for me, and just trying to pin down like what I think about the self. And one of the things that Lacan talks about is that in the mirror stage, when a child is, you know, recognizing themselves for the first time, they're recognizing an image of themselves, and then their parent kind of instinctively, you know, whether they realize they're doing it or not, will start to attach things to that image that the child just adopts as their self. But those are kind of the things that you were mentioning earlier about, you know, like, am I American? Am I Christian? Am I whatever? Like, these are things that we kind of inherit at some point in that mirror stage, or maybe shortly after, that are not necessarily part, you know, they're not a fundamental attribute of that person's self. And so Another aspect of Lacanian thought is the idea of the signifier, which is a sign that refers to another sign and not to an actual object. And that I feel like self is really one of these signifier issues that to talk about yourself, you have to bring up other signifiers, right? And it just becomes a chain where you're gonna constantly have to have more and more and more words to describe yourself, but you're never really going to be able to pin it down. And at the time when I was reading that and studying that, I conflated that, not being able to describe the self in words with the self not existing. But now I don't really think that that's true anymore, just because, I think that the self is phenomenological, and that's really what it boils down to. And because everyone's experience is irreconcilable from every other person's, that you're never going to be able to describe yourself in a way that accurately represents it to another person. And so, yes, you do have a self, but it's not anything that you could really let somebody else in on. Yeah. And so I guess pinning down what it is, what is that self for you is, I think it's really experiential. It's when you're doing the things that, that you feel like you are your highest self, that's kind of, a circular definition, I guess. But it's doing the things that resonate with you and just kind of becoming aware over time of where you are feeling more whole, and where you're feeling more comfortable and like you are living up to your own expectations maybe of yourself, or, rejecting those expectations that aren't really that productive for you. I think that's all part of the process of, discovering who you are.
Yeah. You say that you can't let other people in on it, but it's also I've been thinking about it. Kurt Vonnegut calls it this, every person's an unwavering band of light. So it does feel like, as I've gotten older too, similarly to, I've kind of gone through phases with this where, if you start to think about it too logically, it's easy to come to the conclusion that there's no true self. But I've kind of maybe gotten a little bit more spiritual, and I do believe that within us there is this light, and that I can see it as an empath. I don't know if this is true for sociopaths. I can see when other people's true selves are coming forward. Their light is shining, right? Their unwavering band of light comes forth, and it feels like they are they're being authentic, they're being their true selves. But it's really hard to talk about what that means other than experiencing it, Yeah,
can I stop you right there? You're saying when sometimes you feel that you really see the true self of other people, but it's probably just this tiny moment where you see one self of this person, but it does not have to be this self, but it's kind of the self you're seeing, and the person shows you the self that he is thinking that you want to see, kind of a bit complicated. So how can you be sure that it's really the true self? Because what also Bruce Hood said in his book is that we kind of have or that everyone has kind of different selves, self illusions that are kind of put together to one bigger self, and there can also be some some dissonance. So they kind of sometimes the selves doesn't match perfectly, and that everyone has kind of different selves for every person he's interacting with. So I don't know if you can be sure that this is really the true self of this person you just met.
I totally get what you're saying, because something I have in common with sociopaths is the idea of masking. I have a very wide interest in kind of identity, and I'm and I think everyone to some extent, I'm a different self, right? Or a person, or at least a performance or a mask, depending on the context and the situation. And so I totally get that. I think the moments I'm talking about where I see someone's light, it has less to do with it's so weird, and I get this. But it has less to do with their behavior, or even what they're saying or what they're doing in the moments, or the things that they are. Because you're right, there's yourself, there's how other people see you, there's how you want other people to see you. There's definitely those layers. I 100% agree with that. I think that the self that I see, that light that leaks through, is those moments where that kind of sheds away, and there's like just this this pure light that like shines through those layers. And I don't think
What do you
everyone
mean
would
like
agree with
with
that.
light? What do you mean with light? I mean like no, no, seriously, what do you mean with light?
No, and that's what I'm like saying. It's really difficult to describe it in other words other than that, because it is for
Okay.
me maybe a like what Brendan's saying in terms of yourself being like a phenomenological thing. I think the only moments in which we get to experience other selves in any way is, again, like similarly experiential. I'll have to think more about how I can maybe better describe it though, because I don't want to just leave it hanging as like, yeah, this light, because I think that
Yeah,
there
no,
is
sure.
more to there if I can dig deeper, but I would need to think on it a little bit more.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it is interesting. That probably answers your question, Ryan, is do psychopaths perceive people as having like a light self or something, you know, and probably not is the answer. But interestingly, I was reading in Bruce Hood, he's talking about, so we talked about the mirror stage, which I think happens just before people turn 2 years old. So shockingly, I think to some people, you don't have like a sense of self. You're not able to recognize your identity. None of that seems to be happening until about the age of 2. And in fact, probably this is true, I would guess. If this is not true of you, I'd be very interested to hear. But most people have a cognitive break, essentially around the age, like your earliest memory is not of being 2 years old. For most people, it's closer to about 4 or 5 years old. I'm trying to think. I must have had a memory. My earliest memory is probably 3 or 4 years old. And that we don't really know why that is, although there are some unusual people, and I have a friend who's this way, who can remember back to infancy, or at least they say they remember back to infancy. Most people do not.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think like a lot, like often when people remember like or have memories from when they're younger than 4 or 3 or 4 years old, I think often they just think they remember it because like parents told them. So after some time, you know, like they planted the memory in their head, and you really think this is what happened, but like the memories can be wrong like a lot of the time. I mean, like there's like these experiments where like some people are in a, I don't know, restaurant, and then there's like one actor, like 2 actors, and one actor is stealing the purse of another actor. And then afterwards, they ask the people in the restaurant, hey, what do you think this person looks like? And then like the memories of how the person that, the attacker, how he looks like is like really, really, sometimes really far from the reality. So it's like really easy to plant like a memory in people's heads. So, and I think this is what usually happens when people remember like early childhood memories.
Yeah, so Bruce Hood talks about that too, about how that's kind of a tricky thing in defining yourself, is to the extent that the self is a collection of memories. The memories themselves are so unreliable. And yet he uses another example of, you know, like you can just, by a leading question, completely implant an idea where there was no white car in the video. But if you just ask a question about a white car, somebody's going to say, oh, there was no white car. But 2 months later, they'll remember the video having a white car. Right, so stuff like that, that's pretty crazy to me, especially from the legal perspective, where I'm used to, like, you know, eyewitness testimony being kind of the backbone of the evidence that we provide in any sort of given trial, right? So, but Bruce Hood says, so memory's a weird issue, but he doesn't actually think that the reason why there's a cognitive break, why we can't remember back into 2 years old, he doesn't think it's a memory issue, because people who are 90 can still remember their 20s, right? So it can't be just an issue of it's been too long. Instead, he says that there's at least a theory that is that because you do not have a sense of self, you don't really have any sort of scaffolding with which to kind of interpret and like place the memories. And this is also true. He said that when we are given context for a new piece of information, we're much more likely to remember it than if we don't have context. So he's kind of suggesting, you know, without the sense of self there, maybe there's just nothing for anything to stick to. And so without any sort of context about, like, without us relating to it, you know, personally being like, this makes me feel X, you know, me, the person, me, the self, then we just kind of forget things. So I think that's kind of an interesting concept about sense of self. So we talk about how there is no sense of self, and yet there seems to be a functional reason for why we have at least the perception of a sense of self. What do you guys think? No thoughts? Okay, so we'll see.
I have to think like yeah.
Don't
Let me
worry,
think.
I have more quotes to get to about
Yeah,
this.
just like yeah, spit out some more quotes.
So he is kind of interesting because this is like one of the things he talks about, for instance, and I think this is like very interesting, especially from the perspective of, you know, a psychopathic perspective, people interested in psychopathic things. He says that British children who during World War II were separated from their parents and raised in institutions displayed antisocial behavior as adolescents. This is when he's talking about, you know, how we go through this process of being socialized. So these kids, you know, they lived in London, but London was a dangerous place. It kept getting bombed. And so they lived somewhere else. Or same thing in France. These children who had been separated from their parents during the war, he says, this is a pretty close quote, the way children had been treated in early development had influenced the way they behaved as adults. Their reflective self, which had emerged in a chaotic, uncontrollable social world, had led them to shun social cohesion and conformity as adults. So I think, wow, that is a little bit, I have to say, Elsa, in line with my theory about how psychopaths develop, is that there has to be like some kind of like degree of chaos in the way that they were raised, or even if it's not a regular thing of chaos, at least one chaotic event that was enough to kind of make the child believe like, you know, social cohesion doesn't seem to be like the panacea, let's say, that some people make it out to be. Like, so we have a concept, the American dream, which is like, as poor as you are or whatever, as like disadvantaged as you are, you can eventually grow up to be, you know, I guess middle class is what the American dream is. It doesn't seem that good of a dream, but I guess it was pretty good for people in the 19th century, right? But this idea, I think it would be kind of like psychopaths are just saying like, no, thank you to the American dream. You know, the American dream of being socialized and like, hey, we could be in this socially cohesive unit and you could have yourself, but also be, you know, an American and female and Christian and all these other labels. For some reason that just didn't appeal to the psychopath, and the psychopath was kind of like at a very early age, but was like, you know, I just don't think this is right for me. What do you think, Elsa?
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. And also this is kind of in line with how, like, I think his name is James Fallon, like the neuroscientist who discovered that he is a psychopath when he looked at the brain scans of, like, I think it was Alzheimer patients, and then he found out that he had like the same brain scan as psychopathic murderers. And he did some research on his family history, found out there were a lot of like murderers and serial killers in his like family history. And that he said like there was like one really specific, or it was more like his mother was like a really loving mother to him because she had like some miscarriages before. So she really like gave him a lot of care, a lot of love. And he said that this is probably why he was not like, he didn't go onto this serial killer path, but more on the like science part. And yeah, that he didn't become like really, really antisocial. So yeah, I think I agree with you there.
Yeah. So we have a kind of a question comment from Paula. She says, sometimes I feel like a computer with no operating system pre-installed, having to imagine, improvise how to behave in society. This could be related to the lack of self, I think. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that seems relevant, like definitely, because so for me, I have periods of being more connected to myself and then just like not at all. And so one thing I'm realizing, I'm kind of going through a phase where I have a really weak sense of self. And part of it is just, I think that for the past year, I've been living with other people and around other people who don't know me super well all the time. And I'm constantly masking. And I think after a year of just like constantly masking, I for me, it's very similar to what she's explaining there, kind of feeling like you don't have an operating system. Like I sometimes feel like there's a person inside my head like pulling like the triggers or whatever, but it's like that person isn't anything to me. Like I don't know, and I just feel like distance from myself. And when I get to, I also like get really distanced from my mind and body. Like I have a huge mind body disconnect. And one thing that I think that sociopaths can relate to, at least like I know you relate to, is like this idea of meat machine, like treating your body like inputs and outputs and just like feeling disconnected to it. So you give it what it needs to just shut up and be happy and function or whatever, but like you're not really like thinking about your health like holistically necessarily. It's more like logical and just like, what is it demanding? Yeah, a meat machine is like the best way to describe it. Basically,
Yeah, like no
connection with my
emotional
body.
eating, right? Yeah, stuff like
Yeah.
that. Well, Elsa, what do you? To me, this kind of sounds like, let's say, I mean, your issue with Ryan is Ryan has this perception of self that seems to be too static. I think this is your issue. Correct me if I'm wrong. That the self, and that there is a true self, and that there are moments in which you're experiencing somebody's true self. And I guess kind of using this analogy of a computer and an operating system, it would be like somebody being like, my true self is like the Zoom application, let's say, since we're all using it, whereas like that is actually a very transitory thing. It's updating all the time. It's changing. It's not the same today as it was yesterday, and it's just, it's not actually part of the computer at all, or the phone at all. It's just this like separate thing. Is that kind of like how you feel, Elsa? Like this idea of self as being like, a computer is the actual computer. What we see on the screen is just a projection. And similarly, our brain is like the computer. What we see on the screen, like our perception of self, is just a projection. It's just kind of like this nice, smooth thing that's been designed to kind of simplify life and how we interact with life. Does that sound right, Elsa?
I actually think that's like right for everyone. Like, kind of like the screen you see is just like the interface of like what you perceive from your environment, and like most of the processes you don't even like notice that they are like happening in your brain. Like the brain is hiding so much from you. Like there was in the book from Bruce Hood, there's like this one really cool example. I really tried it, and I didn't know that before. It's like when you look into the mirror and you focus on your one eye, and then you can see like your one eye, and then you shift your gaze into the other eye and you look into your other eye, and like actually the brain blocks out the movement in between, so you don't see your eyes move. So the brain blocks out quite a lot. And I think this is like obviously this is for everyone. So I think this with the computer that fits to everyone, but probably like some people like have like different processes, like obviously than other people. Like for example, like that you have like some parameters that are the same for like some people, and for me it's like changing every time. It's like a variable. It's like every time the process is like is determining this variable again. So maybe I will describe it as like this.
Yeah. So it's interesting because like in reading this Bruce Hood book, there's like so many things where it's like, okay, yes, how can we have a sense of self? Because what is the sense of self? He kind of uses a thought experiment. Is it your brain? Or a lot of people think of themselves, it's not just their brain, but as somebody driving the brain, like somebody driving a car. But then who's in the brain of the person that's driving the car? And then who's in the brain of that person who's driving the car, right? And there's a lot of information that we have about, and maybe Eddie's more familiar with this and wants to talk to it, but there's a lot of information we have about kind of the lack of choice and lack of agency that kind of puts in question our common conception of what it means to have a self.
Yeah, I think they're like the meaning of free will and stuff like that will like also probably play a role. And I also can recommend like a podcast. It's called Very Bad Wizards. It's like a philosopher and a psychologist, David Pizarro, and they are talking like about this free will stuff a lot. And yeah, it's really interesting. So I can recommend it to you.
Yeah. So Eddie, I think you're kind of familiar a little bit with this, like who is it, Sam Harris or whatever,
Yeah.
But why is it, because you have questioned this idea of self. You've been where Elsa is, but like how have you now gotten to the point more where kind of Ryan is about self?
Well, that's an interesting and tough question. And I agree with what Elsa's saying, that you can't be sure that you are witnessing someone's true self, but that you can be sure when you are expressing your true self. And that just has to do with the access problem of consciousness, that you're the only one who's experiencing you, and you can't experience anyone else, you know, by extension, right? And so for me, at least, changing my mind on the conception of self, and I would still say that my conception of self is extremely limited. So much so that, like I said, I wouldn't put it into words. I wouldn't even say that there are words that describe myself, because any word that I would say runs that risk of being misconstrued or interpreted in a different way, and I can't verify your interpretation being the same as my interpretation. And so there is no, you know, there's no way to bridge that gap unless we have some more fundamental, you know, neurological mechanism going on, like the mirror neurons or whatever. And to be honest, I haven't done a ton of research on mirror neurons, but I just remember in my undergrad, one of my professors saying that it was kind of like a bugbear in philosophy, because a lot of people are like looking towards mirror neurons as being this potential explanation for empathy, you know, just being something inherent to human evolution or whatever, but that there's still gaps to be filled in there. And that's, I'm not sure either, because I haven't read enough on that point to say. But these questions are definitely tied up in agency, in conceptions of consciousness, in everything. You know, like, if you want to take a functionalist perspective of consciousness, then there isn't really a need for the self. Or you could say that maybe the self is the system that's accepting the inputs and providing outputs. Like, that could be one definition if you wanted to say that. Or, you know, yeah, go ahead.
With agency, if there's this idea in agency of there being no uncaused cause. Every cause can be traced back to something that preceded it. So if humans are like a machine in that way, and we don't have agency, which honestly I'm kind of in the camp of not really believing in agency, that something within us makes a choice, and it's based on what comes before it. But kind of that, like, that input and output and the measurement of how that choice is made is maybe how we can see who our self is. So yeah, maybe we're not like actually making the choices we think we are, you know, and maybe there isn't agency, but the choice we do make can still say something and point to the self. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. And it's a really tough issue because, like, you know, for example, sometimes I think basically everyone has this experience of you do something that you immediately regret. Well, why did you do it? And what is this regret? You know, what is going on here? And maybe the next time it happens, you're like on the brink of doing it and you notice that you're about to do it and you don't do it. Well, what is going on? What is that mechanism that is noticing? You know, what is the thing that's noticing? Maybe that thing is the self. And like, how does your noticing change your behavior? And what was the cause of that? Was that something that was ultimately exterior to you, if you follow this chain of causes all the way back, or what? And so I feel like there's more questions than answers when it comes to this type of thing. And the philosophy doesn't take you that much closer, to be honest. It just raises more questions.
Yeah, I think they're like neuroscience will probably bring you like a little bit closer, I guess. I think like it has like something to do with it, like, you know, some parts of the brain are used more, like, you know, every time you do something you kind of remember, then like and you'll kind of like make the path bigger, and then I think at some point your brain automatically like knows, oh, okay, this path will lead to, I don't know, regret because I've been there before. So I think this has something to do with that. But yeah, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not 100% sure.
Mm-hmm.
So in reading the Bruce Hood book, we just have a couple more minutes. It's kind of like, I'll give like and we as I keep reading it, maybe we'll schedule another time to talk about some of the insights he has, because he's saying there is an illusion of self. And this, I believe, that most people's perception of self is not what it looks like. It's just the same way that we hear music, but all it is sound waves. You know, we see colors and we see everything else, but all it is light waves, right? And so, you know, all of our perceptions are kind of glossed over, let's say. They're all kind of like, they're much more like an Apple product than they are of 1980s IBM computer. You know, we're not really seeing the underlying processes going on. And so I understand what Bruce Hood is saying there. There's an illusion of self. but he also keeps saying he gives all these examples of people who don't have a good sense of self, and they do not have better lives. And in fact, he uses the example of the Romanian orphanage children, where not only are they like emotionally harmed by like kind of the lack of interaction and development of self, but they also are physically, you know, they never grow to the same height, they don't have the same size brain and all these different things. So I think there's something there. And the thing that I thought, I'll wrap it up because we just have a minute. The thing that I've been thinking about recently is, at the very least, self, especially in social animals like we are, you know, self has to be at least a kind of territorial marking. You know, we have to have some conception in a social dynamic that this is me and me is not you. And I cannot invade you, otherwise you will get upset. And you cannot invade me, otherwise vice versa, right? So I've been at least thinking there has to be at least some kind of sense of self in that aspect. And if that's the only thing, then that's okay, because, you know, we can just learn to enforce boundaries and respect the boundaries of others. But I also think, and we'll try to talk about this next time we talk, I also think there is a little bit something to what Ryan is saying and why Eddie is a convert to this, that there seems to, like expression of self, there does seem to be a resonance. And so I guess we'll all go back to the Bruce Hood, keep reading those quotes, and we'll meet to talk up again in another month. Does that sound good, everybody?
Sounds great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful.
All right, perfect. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the people who hung out with us, and we'll see you next week.